So hello and welcome to day 2 of the AIA Austin Design Excellence Conference. And to our keynote session, Architecture is Our Superpower, with our esteemed speaker, Dan Hart, FAIA. I am Eric Rauser, AIA Austin President, and I'm happy to welcome you to another exciting day, experiencing new content from some of the 106 speakers who are participating in this conference. I encourage you to visit the sponsors and play the games, as well as attending all of the sessions. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank today's keynote sponsor, Daglish Construction. It is only because of our supporters, like Daglish Construction, that we can produce this conference and achieve our organization's mission. As a heritage sponsor, Daglish has supported AIA Austin for over a decade, and we are very grateful. Let's watch a video.
For the past 40 years, the team at Daglish Construction has partnered with Austin's best and brightest architects, designers, clients, artisans, and engineers to build Austin. Throughout all phases of construction, on each of the homes we've built, during every season of those 40 years, our commitment has been to deliver the highest quality construction because details matter. Over the years, we've learned that success is measured not only in the level of product that we can build, but also in the amount of enthusiasm our clients have in recommending us.
We wanted a home that was not just beautiful and didn't just have great finishes, but actually was really soundly constructed at its heart.
They paid attention to every little detail, the tile, the countertops, the color on the walls, the way the house sits on the lot.
People feel happy to be in an environment that is welcoming, that's open, that flows well. We're grateful to have worked with Daglish. We're excited to encourage others to. Really couldn't imagine working with any other builder.
But our job doesn't end when the home is completed. Daglish's home care services team provides full-service, ongoing care of the homes that we build, to give our clients peace of mind that we stand behind our construction.
The home services is an excellent feature for us, especially because we don't live here yet. There's just a lot of peace of mind with that.
We not only provide our services throughout the Austin area, but have a talented team bringing Daglish quality to the Texas Hill Country as well. We at Daglish Construction have enjoyed creating with you over the past 40 years and look forward to many more years of partnership in keeping Texas beautiful.
And now for our speaker. Dan Hart, FAIA, is the Executive Vice President of Architecture for Park Hill, Smith & Cooper, a 380-person firm, and we are glad that he calls Austin home. Dan has been TXA President, an AIA Strategic Council Moderator, a 2017 Texas Tech University College of Architecture Distinguished Alumnus, and the founding president of the college's Design Leadership Alliance. Both architect and engineer, Dan taught architectural engineering at Texas Tech University. Dan currently serves on the AIA Board of Directors, chairs the Public Outreach Committee, and is co-chair of the AIA COVID-19 Business Task Force. He is also running for AIA National 2022 President-elect. Welcome, Dan Hart, FAIA.
Thank you, Eric. I don't know if my screen is showing up yet.
Not yet.
All right. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I wanted to start by talking about Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was a fighter pilot in the Vietnam War, shot down, and was the highest ranking U.S. military officer who was taken captive and served time in the infamous Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war camp. He was in that camp for 8 years between 1965 and 1973. By his count, tortured more than 20 times, had no prisoner rights. There was no set release date given to him, no guarantee or thought that he might even survive to even see his family again. And in spite of all of these dire conditions, in spite of the situation that he found himself in, Stockdale never wavered from having and taking responsibility for his men, trying to maximize their chances of emerging out of this crisis, this whole ordeal, whole. The entire time, fighting against the captors and their desire to use the men as propaganda tools. And so when Jim Collins wrote the book Good to Great a few years ago, he asked Stockdale about his POW experience. And he was curious, Collins, to ask Stockdale, who was it that didn't make it out whole? And Stockdale didn't even miss a beat. He said, oh, that's easy. It was the optimists. That might be a surprising answer, but what he meant was there were those who were naively optimistic. He went on to clarify and said, the optimists were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And then they'd say, oh, well, we'll be out by Easter. Just you watch. We'll be home with our families doing Easter egg hunts. And Easter would come and Easter would go and they'd still be there in the camp. And then they would say, oh, but wait till Thanksgiving. And then it would be Christmas again. And then it would be Easter again. And they were broken. Some of them even died, he said, of a broken heart. So what Collins surmised from this illustration of how we cope and survive with acute crises is he said that what he saw in Stockdale was this ability to retain faith that you will eventually prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. And at the same time, to hold that intention with the ability to and willingness to confront the most brutal facts of the current reality, whatever they might be. So this naive optimism doesn't work. A fixation on the reality of the situation without any hope that there will be an end to it is equally destructive. And I think for most of us, we can relate to one or the other of those extremes, maybe even both of them at different times in our life experience. Sometimes we can become so positive that we become blind to the reality. Sometimes we become so obsessed with the reality that it paralyzes us to inaction. So the key, I think, in what Collins is telling us about Stockdale's experience is in holding those two things in tension. And I think that's what the people that we respect, who are continuing to not only survive but thrive in these difficult times, have the ability to do. I'm so grateful to be with you all today. Thanks, Eric, for that introduction, and thanks to you and Steffi for leading AIA Austin in these remarkable times. It's an extra layer of commitment, I know, for you guys, and it's something I'm sure you didn't envision you were signing up for. I wanted to just say a shout out to Ingrid and Julia and the whole AIA Austin team, and Bridget, Rob, and Courtney for putting this conference on and for everything else you're doing. You're shouldering so much of the burden of the crisis for us architect members at this moment. And what an incredible conference this has been so far. So thank you all for this ability to do just what Collins is talking about in the Stockdale Paradox. The board of directors of AIA, which I've been serving over the last 3 years, last year in our retreat in January, 2019 in January, we were having this discussion about what if we took a different path with this organization. Instead of an approach that says we're a mile wide and just an inch deep. In other words, we do lots of things, but none of them deeply, none of them maybe particularly effectively. But what if we, instead of that approach, we decided that there was something that was so important that we wanted to really make meaningful change and drill really deeply. Interestingly, in our conversation, it became apparent, and we realized that there's an interesting history to this word priority. Before the year 1940, this word didn't show up in literature in its plural form. Think about that for a second. How can you have more than one priority? And that was the basic philosophic approach to this idea before 1940. We Americans got really ambitious and aggressive, maybe coming out of World War II and thinking that we could conquer the world and accomplish so much. And it's natural for us to want to do everything. But it's interesting to think about the history of that word. Priority really doesn't exist in its plural form. And being focused, being intent on making a difference is maybe how we can be most effective. And that's in this retreat in January of 2019, what the board was thinking about where the Institute could go in terms of effectiveness. We had, in 2017, a couple years before this retreat last year, issued a Where We Stand statement on climate change. We had talked about our position on the science of climate change and the vital role that architects must play in combating it. Of course, the Committee on the Environment had enjoyed a long history in our organization and had been one of the most effective and active and accomplished groups within AIA. And it just so happens turns 30 years old this year in 2020. 2020 also happens to be the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And we knew that 2020, as we were sitting in retreat in 2019, looking forward to this year, we knew 2020 was, of course, only 10 years away from the 2030 commitment, which we had been so intent on making clear to our members and to society. The COAT framework had just been launched. The accompanying, that's the vision for how to see sustainability take hold in our practices and in our communities. And the accompanying toolkit, the COAT toolkit, was also launched, the operating manual to achieve that vision. Those were in the works and were being launched as we were talking in our retreat. In the year before, in 2018, we had also adopted revised ethical standards for practice in 3 parts: in the canons, which are the broad principles of conduct; the ethical standards, which are more specific goals toward which each of us should aspire; and the rules of conduct, which are the requirements that are mandatory in our code. We said we wanted focus. We had made the decision that we wanted to be consequential. And so as we thought about this word priority, what our priority needed to be, it was pretty self-evident that the most important thing for us as an organization to be focused on was climate. So we made that decision. I was really proud of us. That's not an easy thing to do. That's not something that happens without some level of courage among board members. When you know that there are so many members with so many different perspectives, so many different political persuasions, so many different individual priorities for our organization. But we knew nonetheless, the time had come for us to be about climate. And so you may remember us talking about the big move. And I think what's lost in that discussion, in the memory of what we were talking about coming out of that retreat in January of 2019, we had actually made two decisions. That AIA would focus on singular, the, not a or an big move, but the big move, singular, consequential, big. If we're going to focus the efforts and resources of this organization on one thing, it better be big enough to warrant that kind of focus. And then action. We wanted this to be a movement, not just words, not just a program, but something that actually recruited people and invested people in what we were about and where we were headed. So the big move became the shorthand way to refer to that first decision. And then the second decision is, what's the focus? What's the object of singular consequential action? And of course, that decision number two was that we wanted to be focused on combating climate change. So last year in our annual meeting in Las Vegas as part of A19 conference, we talked about the ambitious way that we were looking at our future. We had a resolution that was put before the floor as a result of the leadership throughout the Institute coalescing around this singular vision. And this resolution identified three different items: that we were declaring an urgent climate imperative for carbon reduction, that we were interested in transforming the day-to-day practice of architects to achieve zero carbon, equitable, resilient, and healthy built environment by adopting the AIA framework for design excellence. And we were aligning our external messaging to leverage support of our peers, clients, policymakers, and the public at large. These three actions could be summed up in: we wanted everybody to be aligned around unified action. And indeed, the response from the floor of the delegates voting was overwhelming. If you look at the vote here, 4,860 people voted in favor, only 312 against. So there was a real mandate for this direction, and it seemed all corners of the organization were beginning to align and to build energy and momentum around this idea. Later last year, after the conference in September in our board meeting, the board then adopted the COTE Top 10 framework, which then became the AIA Framework for Design Excellence, which is how we refer to it now. And so we took this on as the overarching vision for how we could see sustainability take hold in our firms, in our communities, in our chapters, in our experience as architects. And so many of you, I'm sure, on this call are already well aware of this framework, but I'm gonna walk us through it just to make sure that we're those who are seeing it maybe for the first time or have not spent time thinking about it. There are 10 different measures in this framework, and what this framework attempts to do is to take a holistic look at what it means to create sustainably in the built environment. So the first measure is design for integration. This has the question of what the big idea behind the project is. How does it all come together? How does form and function integrate to reinforce the goals of the project? The second measure, design for community, is an interest in the built environment beyond the property lines of a project. How do we create walkable, human-scaled community, both within and beyond the purview of the project that we're focused on? The third measure, design for ecology, asks the question of what is this built environment piece doing to contribute to the ecology of the place where it finds itself? Architecture, of course, is so place specific that we saw the need for this measure to be focused on the ecology of place and responsive to what's happening, macro and microclimate all the same. The fourth measure, design for water. How do we use water wisely? How do we handle rainfall responsibly? How does this project fit into the overall regional watershed? Design for economy is about providing abundance while living within the means of the project. It's a fundamental challenge of design. How do we provide more with less? Is it possible to build and design sustainably and not kill the budget? Design for energy, the sixth measure, is what does the project, how does the project address climate change through reduction, particularly of and generation of decarbonization of energy use? So a particular view toward energy in that sixth measure. And the seventh is a design for wellness consideration. Knowing that great design supports comfort, health, wellness for the people who inhabit or visit buildings, how does the design promote the health of the occupants? This is something that I'll talk more about and that we're intently interested in these days. The eighth measure, design for resources. What are materials and products selected and designed to reduce environmental impacts while enhancing building performance? How are we going about that selection? The ninth measure, design for change. How does this project address future risks? How adaptable is this project to anticipated and unanticipated future uses? The most sustainable building there is the one we're not tearing down. And so how do we make sure that the buildings that we are repurposing now and that we're creating now will have utility well into the future, no matter what happens with how we use them? And then finally, the 10th measure is sort of a looking back on what we've accomplished kind of measure. How do the outcomes that we see in the project match the expectations during design? And as importantly, how well are we sharing our success? How well are we telling others about what worked for us and what didn't work for us? How well are we telling society what really matters about the project that we have just completed? And how do we maintain a long-term relationship between the design team and those that are occupying and operating the building so that we can know those things, so that we can celebrate what works and adjust what hasn't worked? One of the things that I appreciate most about this vision, this framework, which has a whole variety of other tools and spreadsheets and manipulatives to help us along the way of quantifying the behavior and performance of the building, in addition to the physical presence that the building has and the impact that it has on the fabric of community. One of the things that I appreciate most about this framework is that it really embodies this statement: lead with a vision instead of a checklist. This is not about some kind of reduction to gadgets or reduction of the quality of experience that we all know about building and place to some objective set of criteria or facts. It continually points us back to the bigger picture of the overall vision. And this quote from Paul Hawkins: good management is the art of making problems so interesting and their solutions so constructive that everyone wants to get to work and deal with them. And that's the idea of a movement, that it's a compelling enough, consequential enough thing that we recruit advocates and we recruit those who are going to come along and support the effort. And so many of these slides in this presentation today come from my friend Corey Squire, who's also on the agenda for this conference and has been so instrumental in formulating the framework and the toolkits and all of the different things that we now enjoy as the Institute broadly that are helping us move toward this direction in this movement. Shout out to Corey. Thank you, sir. So we had done it, right? We had identified our direction. We were bold and courageous. And not only had we identified direction and focus, we had picked the right thing. I mean, we were off and going, and energy had built up, and momentum was there, and we were ready to go. And 2020 is the year of perfect vision. And boy, wasn't it going to be great? Well, guess what? So COVID comes on the scene and says, we have a different idea about what is going to occupy your attention. So you're sitting on the board of directors of AIA National. What do you do? How do you respond to this significant block in the path to what we had envisioned for where we were headed? You just ignore it and hope it goes away? I suppose we could have done that. Or do you survive and do the best you can to cope and endure and hopefully find ways to emerge out of that? Well, the crisis was so acute and so sudden and so prolific in its consequences that there really was no choice but to occupy the full attention of the board. I want to rewind 100 years for a second and just reflect on a pandemic that struck this country. Was an influenza pandemic in 1918 and 1919. This is a photo of train conductors in New York City in 1918. I'm really struck when I came across this photograph because I realized that the main technology that we're utilizing at this point, until we have proper therapeutics and vaccine, is physical distance and masks. And this is technology that really hasn't changed a lot in 100 years. It's really remarkable to think about. Now, obviously, we've got technology on our side in terms of being able to do this conference remotely that they didn't have then. And we've got a lot of technology working for us toward solutions in vaccine that are going to come at a record pace, we hope. But isn't it remarkable? Some things, as much as we think we advance, don't change a lot. I wanted to reflect on this influenza at this time in our history because there's something really remarkable about it. John Barry, the author of the book, The Great Influenza, reports that as conditions worsened in our country, healthcare workers in city after city pleaded for volunteers to take care of the sick. Nobody stepped forward. In Philadelphia, the head of emergency aid pleaded for help in taking care of sick children. Nobody answered. There was one account that said there are families in which every member is ill, in which the children are actually starving because there's no one to give them food. The death rate is so high, and still people hold back from helping. David Brooks, in his New York Times column, explains this is one of the most puzzling features of the 1918 pandemic. When it was over, nobody talked about it. There was not seemingly much impact on the culture. There were no books written about it. There were no plays written about it. And think about this. 675,000 Americans died in this pandemic. World War I had just was coming toward some conclusion. There were 53,000 people that died in battle in World War I compared to 675,000. And yet this pandemic left virtually no cultural mark on us. Interestingly to me, to find out, one of the biggest hotspots in the country was our neighbors in San Antonio. They had 86,000 infections in San Antonio. Now think about this. 86,000 infections was more than half of the population of the city. Over 50% of San Antonio was infected. There was some speculation about military spread of infection because of the military activity in San Antonio base, but over half the population was infected. This had such a deep impact on us. Why didn't we talk about it? And so there's speculation. Maybe it's because we were not very proud of who we were in that pandemic. In that time of crisis, we did not step up and be aware and open to our better angels. It was a shameful memory, and therefore maybe we suppressed it. In her 1976 dissertation, A Cruel Wind, Dorothy Ann Pettit argues that the 1918 flu pandemic contributed to a kind of spiritual torpor afterward. People emerged from it physically and spiritually fatigued. She says the flu had a sobering and disillusioning effect on the national spirit. And we didn't want to talk about it. It's a really tragic thing in so many different dimensions. But I want to tell you, I believe we're going to be talking about COVID-19 for years to come. And I think that's true in society, and I think it's particularly true in AIA. And I suspect that the momentum and energy that we had built that was poised and ready to go on our focus toward addressing climate change and taking action, I think the evidence that that energy and momentum had built can be seen in the response that we quickly redirected to COVID. AIA really took action quickly, and this is true at the national level. It's true for AIA Austin. It's true at the state level, the Texas Society of Architects, and many other states. New York State is just incredible what they did to marshal resources and to respond. We had countless resources generated, vetted, put on the webpage very quickly. Our government advocacy team went to work immediately and started lobbying for relief package, which became the CARES Act, which has benefited architecture firms really dramatically. The Paycheck Protection Program advocacy was right there and lobbying on our behalf right away. The knowledge community stepped in and started offering webinars and courses and papers and participating in task forces. The Equity and the Future of Architecture retooled its whole mission and started to focus on recent graduates, thinking about the plight that they were experiencing coming out, thinking about graduation and what the job market was going to look like. I think we're going to be talking about COVID-19 in AIA, because I think we're going to be proud of who we were in this crisis. In addition to all of that, Jane Frederick, our president, appointed 4 different task forces. The first 2 looking at healthcare professionals and trying to identify and be able to make ready surge capacity for our hospitals, which we were sure were going to be overwhelmed. The work that they did in Task Force 1 was adopted by the US State Department, translated into multiple language, this building assessment tool, and used all over the world. These were AIA volunteer members, and they produced that work in the matter of about 2 weeks. Incredible response. They were working day and night on that. The Task Force 2 then took those recommendations and looked at ways to implement those community by community. Task Force 3 was the task force that I'm privileged to co-chair with my friend Mark Levine, focused on continuity of firms and business. How do we survive and thrive beyond COVID-19? And Task Force 4 has been the latest to get started, and they're looking at component health and vitality. How do we resource our components and chapters who've been hit so hard by this crisis and have precious little relief? So Task Force 3 in particular, we generated a lot of articles. We generated this guide to focus on clients and help our clients see their way through to thriving in this crisis and encourage them to get architects designing things so that when we emerge out of this crisis, they're shovel ready and they're first in line to get their projects built, stimulating the economy, giving those clients good construction pricing because of the competition that will be there. So we were busy providing those resources. We're about to roll out a symposium later this year, a 2-hour sharing of these different resources. We're also cataloging video interviews of firm leaders from all over the country and how they've responded to COVID, to both learn from it and to also have some archival value going forward. But the reason I wanted to share with you about that task force in particular, when Mark and I convened that group, there were 10 of us on the task force. And the first thing we did was we went around the room and had everybody introduce themselves. And as we were making those introductions, one of our members had a firm of 50 people, and he shared with us he had just laid off 15 of his folks. Another person on the task force had a firm of 8 people, and he informed us that they had just done across the board significant salary reductions to try to stay in business. And I was so moved. Here we were, not knowing where this crisis was headed. Those 2 members in particular suffering in a profound way as a result of the crisis. And here they were sitting in a meeting to help provide resources for their peers. I think we're going to be proud of this moment. I think we're going to be proud of who we were as AIA in this moment. I'm pleased to say both of those members of the task force as a result of PPP, and I think in some part as a result of the conversations we had about resources that they could take advantage of. The first one has hired back those 15 people. The other has just secured a very large job, which is going to sustain them through the crisis as well. So there is some happy silver lining to that, the involvement that they had on that task force. But I'll never forget their willingness to be a part as they're having these great challenges themselves, to be a part of solutions. So what do you do with COVID? Survive, cope, endure, emerge. That's what we had to do immediately. But as the crisis unfolded, we started to ask ourselves, what are we learning from this? What if we approach this as never letting a good crisis go to waste? I saw one blogger suggest that COVID-19 is a great way to look at climate change, that this crisis was a dress rehearsal for addressing climate change. We all know from our life experience it's often the darkest times that provide the most illumination. What are we learning? So we started to shift our focus to start to think, okay, we've addressed the current crisis, at least in some ways, and we're finding ways to continue to work. What's it going to take for us to get back to our first priority of climate change, and how are we going to go about that? And then May 25th, George Floyd is killed. We had nationwide protests and angst and social unrest and all the rest. I don't have to tell you what happened. Another crisis on our hands and another profound societal vector that AIA necessarily had and needed to address. Been really struck by Isabel Wilkerson, who just released this book the week before last. I haven't read it yet, but I heard her interviewed, and her reframing of this social inequity and racial injustice in terms of the framework of caste, I think is really compelling, and I think it may have a chance of changing the way we talk about race and systemic institutional racism that we have seen over the last 400 years at least. Isabel Wilkerson is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, author of The Warmth of Other Suns. You may have seen that book about the Great Migration. I love how poignantly she talks about The invisible infrastructure of race oppression is what she's calling caste. It's the way that we sort peoples into categories, and it's mostly invisible. It's infrastructure that's mostly invisible. That's caste. That's the bones, she says. Race is the skin. It's the outward sign. It becomes a marker for which we use as a convenient way to sort folks into different castes. And then on top of the skin is the clothing, which she calls class. That's the ability to be upwardly mobile or to have education or to advance in society, but that's the clothing. And so they become increasingly superficial and surface. But the real problem that we've got to address, come to terms with, admit, be honest about, is this invisible part, the invisible infrastructure of caste. And so now we have a third crisis, interlocking, interconnected, also on our hands. So we issued as a board, definitely was something that caught our attention and it needed to, and we issued a statement on systemic racial injustice, knowing that wasn't enough, but that we needed to respond. I think those of us who come from positions of privilege in society are just ashamed of ourselves and how little attention we've been paying to these racial systemic issues in our society. And we talked again, we celebrated the anniversary last year of Whitney Young's address to AIA in Portland, when we had less than 2% of our membership African American, and he called us out. And here we are in 2020, less than 2% of our membership African American. We have not made progress, and it's atrocious. And so what do you do when you have a priority and you have these nested interlocking crises that come to occupy your attention? What's our priority? Some of you were in New Orleans for Grassroots. I gave a speech then and talked about climate change, climate action being our mountain. That's the mountain that we have chosen to climb. And I said then that I felt that there would be other hills and valleys to navigate along the way to climb our mountain. That climate change could not be the only thing. It was just our most important thing. And it was important that we saw it both as the focus of our work and a framework through which we saw all of our other work. And that in climbing a mountain, that gives us perspective on the other hills and valleys that we have to navigate that we wouldn't otherwise have. I had no idea we were sitting in a hot spot of COVID right before Mardi Gras in New Orleans and what was about to unfold. And as I talked about bringing all of this home, I had no idea we were all going to go home, or that we would be dealing with the really deep issues of racial injustice in May. I've been really helped by this idea of Stephen Covey's, of what he calls the circle of concern, which is, this is an ellipse on your screen here, but the idea is this circle represents everything you and I have on our minds that might be concerning us. And he says there's a smaller concentric circle within that larger circle that he calls a circle of influence. That circle is much smaller. It's totally enveloped in the larger circle, but that circle represents the things that we can actually have an impact on. So the question is, what can you and I do to grab pieces of that bigger context of all of the concerns we might have to be able to actually do something about within our own circle of influence, where we have the ability to make a difference? The fascinating thing about this idea to me is that if we are not active within our circle of influence, if we are not making an effort to have an impact within that circle of influence, what happens is our circle of influence shrinks. We become less and less and less influential. The happy other side of that same coin, that is, if we are intent and acting within our area of influence, doing the things that we possibly can do, our circle of influence will grow into our circle of concern. We become more influential if we're active, playing on our gifts, our perspective, our skills, our talents. And so this is true for all of us as individuals. It's also, this is a great thing, by the way, a conversation to have with a young architect when they come to me in my firm and say, what does it take to be a principal? I ask them what's on their desk. What do you have right now? How are you doing with what you have right now? If you'll go kick it on that, your circle of influence is going to grow. Things will take care of themselves over time. It's true for us as individuals. It's also true for us as an organization. And I think we need to, one of the key things here is to have the wisdom and the ability to discern the difference between what's within our circle of influence and what is really outside of our ability to have an impact on. So you look at these three nested crises and you look at the sweet spot between those three, we start to get a clue as to where our influence might lie. And we start to think about the built environment being part of what guides us and defines what our circle of influence is as a profession, as an organization. Within that sweet spot of the intersection of these crises, we start to understand maybe our priority wasn't off in the first place. Maybe there's enough to say about what these three things have in common that we can have impact and leverage on all three of them if we're smart about how we go about it. So as I ask myself, what did we learn from COVID? I have three observations. The first one is we would have been so much better off if from the beginning we had listened to credible experts on COVID-19. That tells us what we need to do. The second observation I have is we need to understand the exponential consequences of a global crisis like infection spread. We were talking about 15 cases being present in the US at the beginning of this crisis, and that maybe they would just go away. We had no clue collectively of the impact of geometric explosion, of the compounding effect of infection. It doesn't just expand linearly, it expands exponentially. And that means we've got to get to work right now. The good news of exponential consequences is if you can tamp them down early, they will compound in the tamping effect. We can have outsized effect if we'll act early, but we didn't unfortunately do that too well in COVID as a country. And then the third observation I have is this whole thing about think global and act local. We have got to be able to see what the global strategy is, but then we've got to be able to site adapt those solutions community by community. What works for COVID in Austin is not necessarily the right best approach in Miami or New York or Seattle or Pensacola. And so the ability to site adapt global solutions becomes really important. And by the way, these three observations about COVID hold true in racial injustice. We need to listen to the historians and social scientists. We need to understand the compounding effects of economic oppression on people over 400 years. And then we need to, community by community, listen and adopt the best ways of going about creating community one by one. And by the way, those same three things apply to global climate change. The difference in climate change is that it's unfolding at a slower pace than what we're seeing in COVID. We've had a chance, if we will frame this properly, to illustrate with something that everybody has just undergone together in COVID-19. We can use those metaphors to help people, the public, understand what needs to happen with global climate change. Our priority maybe hasn't changed if we see this properly. I often get asked the question by members, Dan, should we focus really as AIA on our members' needs, or should we focus on societal challenges? My answer is quick and easy. Yes. I think it's actually a false question. I don't think I think the most effective way to meet members' needs is to focus on societal challenges. So our social contract with the public is that we are the stewards and the protectors of the built environment when it comes to health, safety, and well-being. And so if we look at those three realms of our basic charge to society, we, in turn, for taking care of that realm of the built environment, health, safety, and welfare, we have status in society, we have particular advantages in terms of being compensated, we have laws that protect our practices, so forth. So there's a contract there. And in return, we protect that part of our existence. If you overlay the three crises that we're enduring right now and to think about, should AIA be addressing societal challenges? Isn't it interesting how closely these map to our basic charge, our basic social contract? COVID maps very easily to health, doesn't it? CAST maps very conveniently to safety, especially when you think about social safety in society. And then climate maps, when you think about the well-being of the planet and ultimately the well-being of all of us on it, maps pretty conveniently to climate. So this is not so far. If we think about what our circle of concern is, all of those things that might occupy our attention, and focus on this center sweet spot of where we maximize our effect, this puts us right at the center of society's most difficult, wildest challenges. And so if we look at those crises that we're thinking about right now, and our social contract, which is HSW and the built environment, and we think about this tool that we have of design and how to address those crises, then we start to spell out our own relevance. And I think for too many years in AIA as members, and I've been guilty of this as anybody else, we have talked about relevance instead of being intent on showing that we're relevant. I think in COVID-19, we did a much better job of showing rather than telling. And by the way, once we're relevant, we become valuable to society, prosperity in the broadest sense, quality of life, compensation, all of it comes as a result. But right in the middle of this consideration, I just want to emphasize design is our superpower. That is the thing that sets us apart. That is the thing that makes us so valuable. And we need to know that as architects, and we need to know the impact that we can have on society. And when you pair this ability and aptitude that we have to bring people together around robust solutions, in our ability to site adapt the big strategy and make particular solutions community by community, I believe our way through and beyond this historic convergence of all three of these crises is in recognizing community as our true domain and in our taking appropriate action in that realm. We're going to find relevance and prosperity along the way. So I'm going to wrap up here. I wanted to tell you a story. I've been really pleased during this work from home at how my usual travel schedule has been interrupted, and I've been home and I've been able to be much more disciplined about my daily habits. One of those is an early morning run most mornings, on the mornings when I can do that. And my daily run takes me through a park. And one day, this is about 4 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago maybe, I came up behind a man walking on a 6 foot wide sidewalk. So for a second and a half, as I came up behind him, and I went as wide as I could around him, but there were some hedges keeping me from going off the sidewalk. We were within a couple of feet of each other. I didn't have 6 feet. I didn't stop to listen to him, but I didn't need to. He was yelling at me, 6 feet, 6 feet. And I was incensed. How dare you tell me? I am an enlightened individual in society. I'm conscientious. I understand the impact of infection spread. And for 20 minutes of my run, I was just fuming with myself about how he could feel like he felt about me. And then it dawned on me, of course he's right. Why couldn't I have just stopped and let the moment pass so I could go around him with a wider berth? He confronted me with the brutal facts of the crisis that we were in. So on the way back, same run, my neighborhood is at the top of a steep hill. So that means that my run ends in a pretty intense grind. And I was just about to come to the top of the hill, pushing really hard, and I saw something over my left shoulder. And there was a man on a bike standing up on his pedals, working to get up the same hill. And he looked over at me and he smiled and he said, "We can do this." And I just thought, there in that one run was the Stockdale Paradox. Being confronted with the hard, brutal facts, and at the same time, being encouraged and having the faith that we will prevail. We can do this regardless of the difficulties. And I think it's leadership that recognizes that balance that is so helpful in a time like this, to see that our priority for climate action is intact. It's taking some detours, things that we didn't expect, but we're learning as we go. And our approach to climate action is going to be so much fuller and so much more whole because of the experience of these other crises. This is our site. There are countless challenges. There's a looming deadline. This is the ultimate project. It's time to show the world what design can do. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Dan. That was excellent, inspiring as always. I'm going to give us a minute for anybody who has a question to type it into the Q&A. I know myself, I am not the fastest typer, so we're going to give everybody just a couple minutes in case they have any follow-up questions. It is really interesting, Dan, the way that you're framing the challenge that we as a profession are facing. And so one of the things that seems so daunting in our chapter is how we address social justice. And at the same time, so much energy is coming towards us from people eager to be a part of the change and being a part of making our profession what we all want it to be. And so I was wondering just if you have any thoughts on how at the national level the organization is looking to channel that energy and make real change and make lasting change.
Yeah, there's so much in that question, Eric. We are currently working, we've formulated a framework for to combat racial injustice. And we're working now on an action plan to take particular steps. But if that's a design process, and I prefer to see everything we do in that light, then we're in the programming phase. We're listening first. And I think that's so crucial. There's such momentum and such energy around doing something and showing that you're doing something. And we need to do that. We need to respond, and we've issued statements, and I'm glad we have done that. But that cannot be all that we do. And what we do needs to not be imposed on communities in society, but rather needs to come organically from communities. And so it's, again, this is what architects do, right? The best among us know how to come to really complex situations and make sense of all of the various perspectives and parameters and make something beautiful and elegant and whole out of it. So there's a real challenge here in a tension between coming out with a program quickly and to say, look, at AIA is doing this and here we are. I want to have that kind of urgency about our work, but I want to make sure that it's lasting and consequential and durable. And so it seems to me there's a lot of theater of things that look nice, but are they really going to have lasting effect? And I'm not interested in that at all. And so we are working toward that. There are a number of initiatives. It so happens within AIA, there was a resolution in 2018 that was focused on how do we have the opportunity for more women of color to rise up in our organization and leadership. And so we've now developed, it's just gone operational, a program. 16 women are being having opportunity for leadership development. It's a 2-year program. The first year, they're going to be being equipped. The second year, they'll continue in their training and equipping, but then they become mentors to the next class of women. And so forging those relationships, helping people have the space to be able to interact with each other is vitally important to this. They seem like small things, but they end up being really important. We had such a great, energizing conversation, the AIA National Board, with the board of the National Organization of Minority Architects last week. And I happened to be in a small group with the president of the board of NOMA, Kimberly, and she was talking about how, Kimberly Dowdell, she was talking about how important it is for people to be able to see themselves, to be able to imagine becoming an architect or becoming a leader. And so that becomes really important. But I think the thing that really impacted me more about what she was saying is that we've got folks in society that maybe have the aptitude and capacity and wherewithal to become architects and become part of the architecture design community, but they're looking at the current state of our profession and they're going to throw all of their lot in with our profession that doesn't pay enough. And so what do we do about raising compensation so that it's worthwhile for people to want to become engaged in what we're doing? So there's a vast array of ways that we need to question everything.
Well, Dan, I'm afraid I threw a giant question at you. We only had a few minutes. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending. Please enjoy the rest of the conference. And please reach out to Dan and myself with any further questions or any desire to discuss. Okay, thank you all.
Thanks, Eric.